Hey there, what do you think when you think of gay conversion therapy? Hi, Glenn here, and welcome, if you are new, or welcome back to the Right Reason YouTube channel. Now, if you've seen me sitting in front of this camera in the past, you might notice that I'm in a new physical environment, one that I think looks much nicer than the previous one, which was just kind of a blank wall. I'm in my new old house, so this old house that is new to me. I think it's a much better space to record in, and I'm very pleased to be here. Hey, it's Tuesday today, and this weekend just gone, I had the pleasure of going down to Nelson. It was a great pleasure, and I met David Riddell. Now, David Riddell is a counsellor. I wasn't seeing him in his capacity as a counsellor, not that there's anything wrong with that, of course, but I was seeing him and speaking with him because some time ago now, in New Zealand was passed a piece of legislation banning, or at least allegedly for the purpose of banning, gay conversion therapy. And I wrote a little bit about that at my blog at the time, and David gained a bit of notoriety at that point because he, again, allegedly at least, is a therapist who practices so-called gay conversion therapy, although whether or not it's fair to call it that, you'll hear from him. And there were some pretty unkind things being said about David at the time, some things that were potentially untrue. And because I found that subject interesting, because I'm also considering going into psychology and the whole area of therapy myself, I thought it would be interesting, and I think fair as well, to sit down with David, to get him in front of a camera, to hear him in his own words, to see what he has to say for himself, but also just to hear where he's coming from and what his perspective on this, on the whole world of counselling and therapy is, as someone who is a Christian and as someone who, well, got tangled up in this controversy. I think it went well. I think it was an interesting conversation. I found David to be a very interesting guy, and I hope you agree. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. Let's see what you think of this.
Okay, let's go.
Well, I'm here with Dave Riddell at Living Wisdom here in Nelson. David, thank you so much for making time in your busy schedule to see me.
My pleasure, I hope. We'll see.
I'm sure it will be. I try not to read things, but I did bring the questions with me just so I don't forget them and I don't run out of things to say, but I'm sure you will not run out of things to say. That's my suspicion. David, I want to talk to you initially just about some thoughts that you have on faith, Christian faith, because you are a Christian, and the broad world of counselling and therapy, which you are embedded in. Ballpark question, how have you found the world of counselling as an environment for Christianity? Would you say it is generally speaking welcoming, or generally speaking perhaps a bit more hostile?
Oh, it's a battleground, absolute battleground. You've got the moralists versus the amoralists versus the immoral. You've got client-centred versus directive. You've got authoritative counselling versus no authority whatsoever, nothing but paraphrasing, people nonsense. You've got what John Cleese referred to as overpriced parrots. You've got the whole range, and it's a battleground, and it's a mess. Ethically, philosophically, it's an absolute dog's breakfast.
Okay, well that's okay. That's an interesting portrait.
There's no other way to characterise it. Philosophically, there's a massive chasm runs right down through the centre of psychology. You know, look at the shifting sand in the DSM 3, 4, 5. None of them agree with each other.
That's true.
It's on the move.
Yeah.
The whole thing is built on jelly. And the problem is that every person has turned away from authority and moved to emotion-based reasoning. They've moved to indulgence. They've moved to crowd-pleasing. They've lost their way, philosophically, ethically. And Francis Schaeffer himself said, you know, look at where the world goes. 7 years later, the church will follow. Well, if that's not blind guides leading the blind, what is?
What do you mean when you say authority? Because some, people who are looking at being counsellors and doing any sort of training in psychology will think, authority? What sort of authority should we have?
Well, it starts with the Western anti-authority stance. If you're anti-authority, then by definition you have to be anti-God, you have to be anti-absolutes, you have to be anti-reality, because you're making up the rules as you go along. And therefore reality is whatever you want it to be, which is a New Age creed. Now that's deep inside the modern psychology philosophy, and it's a terminal illness. Basically, it's psychology committing suicide.
Okay. Sounds like a pretty dire description.
Oh, it is, and don't underestimate it. This is why the Western world is currently committing philosophical suicide, intellectual suicide, moral suicide, and religious suicide. Those cracks and splits show up in every aspect. The church, in psychology, in psychotherapy, in New Age thinking, it's a shambles. You can't describe it any other way if you've really looked into it.
Okay. Well, this is a question that I think will be of interest possibly to people who are out there studying psychology. I'm a psychology student, full disclosure, or people who are interested in counselling, or maybe who might think that they are called into that field if they're Christians. Now you know this already, but for others, when you study psychology, there are like schools, there are approaches that you can take, and they have names like cognitive behavioural therapy, the psychoanalytic approach, person-centred, and so on. Of those that are actually taught, do you think that there is a particular approach that you find is especially compatible with your Christian worldview, or is it all doomed?
Well, living wisdom, which is the modality that I put together, is eclectic. It does take from psychoanalytic theory, it does take from cognitive, it does take from rational emotive, but in terms of Christian-friendly modalities, I would go for cognitive therapy and rational emotive behavioural therapy every time. There's nothing in the Bible, for example, that contradicts those modalities. But when you look at some of the pop psychologies and modalities of the day, they're nothing short of make up the rules as you go along, or reality is whatever suits you, or you just have to scream to get it all out. Absolute nonsense.
Because there is and when you study psychology, you're not told that there is a particular one that you have to follow, but one that's quite popular has the unfortunate, I think it's unfortunate name of humanist approach, where they practice what they call unconditional affirmation of the client's perspective, which strikes me as, wait a minute, aren't you the expert? Why are you unconditionally affirming everything your client says when he comes to you with some kind of brokenness, some kind of problem?
Well, that was what Carl Rogers instigated back in the 60s, and it was swallowed hook, line and sinker. It was swallowed uncritically. It was swallowed by a population that had lost their way morally and had lost authority, and as a result he stripped out the authority of any dogmatic or Catholic or religious institution, but he also renounced it as a failed experiment. This unconditional positive regard basically led straight into unconditional approval of whatever the client thinks.
Well, this is the thing, because in practice, the way that I've seen this, when I've spoken to people who have been in therapeutic situations, what happens is the practitioner just affirms as true whatever the client says about themselves. So if they for example, a young woman comes in and says, "I think I'm a man," well, you are, because who am I to not affirm where you're coming from?
And at that point, you immediately lose your way. You become lost. You become lost morally, ethically. You become lost in terms of any form of authority. And every person then becomes the authority in their own world. Their sovereignty is taken as absolute. And so all you can do is paraphrase what they're telling you and become John Cleese's overpriced parrot.
I do love John Cleese.
And by the way, again, I say that Carl Rogers and Rogerian client-centred, people-centred counselling was discredited totally, and he himself renounced it before he died. But his daughter would not allow that new revelation into the book that her father published. She basically sat on it.
I hadn't heard that. So Rogers basically changed his mind about
Yes,
unconditional
he did.
affirmation.
And he wrote a chapter called A Failed Experiment. And then he died, and his daughter did not allow it to be published.
That's fascinating. Okay.
And I heard that from his colleague and partner, Charles Colson. Charles Colson himself
So
tried to...
did you know a colleague of his?
Yes, Charles Colson, and he went on a tour to try and trumpet this renunciation, but by then all the institutions were so hooked in it they wouldn't hear it. Yeah, they wouldn't hear it.
That is curious, okay.
And the other thing, of course, that gave it wings is that the institution said, now here's a good way to avoid becoming liable for our students' mistakes. If they give bad direction, we're no longer liable because we taught client-centred counselling, not authoritarian or authoritative.
That's right, it was the client.
That's right. And so, that was out for them to avoid getting their own hands dirtied or to get sullied by their novice counsellors.
Okay. Now, I know that it's dangerous to draw hasty conclusions about correlation and causation, but it's all over the place, whether it's the World Health Organization or random individual therapists and everything in between. We hear that there is this ongoing rise in the prevalence of mental health issues. Sometimes we'll talk about a mental health crisis during the same time that some people seem to be crowing about the fact that census results show that religious faith is in decline. Now, I know the sorts of things that I've read about based on a variety of studies, but you've worked in this field for, 30-odd years?
Yes.
I want your opinion. Based on what you've seen, are these things connected? The decline of faith and the increase in psychological issues?
Well, there's a sequence here. When you react against authoritarianism, which you're perfectly right to do, authoritarianism results in perpetual children who can't think for themselves. But you also throw out authoritative, if you confuse the two. And you throw out authoritative because you're anti-authoritarian. The result is no authority vested anywhere, and all you've got left is dogma and idealism and ideolatry. And so that's a very dangerous result. The result is that mental health is whatever you want to make it. Did you ever see that movie Lars and the Real Girl? That was a portent of where this was going to go. And when the village went to get help from the professional psychiatrist and psychotherapist, she said, you cannot oppose a psychosis or a delusion. You can only agree with it if you want to hold the trust of the person in crisis. And so the whole village decided they would indulge this blow-up doll as a real fiancé that you really could get married to. And they even went to the point of attending the wedding of the person who was marrying their blow-up doll. Now, this is the laughable and the epitome of where actually our psychology is taking us. By definition, a delusion should be confronted. But there's a whole psychological community now that said you dare not confront the delusion, you can only indulge it. And so what happens to psychosis when it's indulged? It doubles and triples in strength. And that's why when parents lose the power to confront their children and say, not that way, this way, with whatever way seems right to you, go for it, then they abandon the child and they abandon their client to a delusion and psychosis, and the result is there's no more reality, there's no more absolute truth, there's only relativity and relativism, and relativism is a shortcut to insanity. Am I putting too fine a point on this?
No, you see, tell us what you really think.
I'm hoping I'm doing that.
Yeah.
Because, of course, you understand that I run the risk here now of being condemned for hate speech or being condemned for being anti-this or anti-that. But in my world, you're still allowed to hold your own opinion and you're still allowed to observe what's going on around you, but only just.
Yeah.
Only just. It will soon be a criminal offence to observe what is going on around you and to make statements.
And to simply describe it as it is.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's why we are up against a tyranny, forces of tyranny that are forming now, and fanaticism in government that are forming now, and the harvest is coming. It's right round the corner.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Are you a doomer?
Well, a doomer in one sense, that we are doomed if hate speech laws are put through, and we are doomed if the rainbow agenda is inflicted upon free people and heterosexuality. Yes, I am a doomer.
Okay.
But make no mistake, I have every hope that truth pervades against delusion.
It's interesting, and this is purely a tangent. I had no thought that I would say this. The way that a number of ideologies, and I'll describe yours as an ideology, true or not, has its own different version of, I guess, sort of an end times apocalyptic conflict.
Well, it's a perspective whether mine is a thesis or an antithesis or a synthesis. But that's the problem. Today, the thesis, the predominant thesis, is given legitimation, and the antithesis is given criminal status. And I present at the stage the antithesis of the ideology of the rainbow community and the antithesis of the ideology of the hate speech laws.
Gosh, it sounds like an extraordinary degree of freedom when you can just say, I represent the antithesis of the rainbow community. That would get you not quite shot, but
well, put it this way, they want tolerance, and they want to hear their perspective put, and I am listening, and I have been listening for 40 years, but I expect the same from them, that they will listen to me and my observations, but I'm not getting that. Okay, so tolerance is great as long as it only goes one way in their mind. Yeah.
Okay.
That's false compassion. It's hidden. It's actually a hidden religion. And I'm starting to get a little bit annoyed by it. So hence I'm speaking to you now.
Yeah, quite directly, which I admire. What prompted my question about the rise in the prevalence of psychological issues and the decline of religious faith is I don't pretend to have done extensive research on it, but a number of studies that I've looked at indicate, contrary to the way that some people might expect things to be, that people who are more committed to religious faith are statistically less likely to suffer from things like acute depression or anxiety or a number of psychological issues.
Well, Glenn, what is mental health? I've been studying this topic for 70 years. What is mental health? I was asking myself questions about what is mental health when I was a child. So I've been on a very long journey. And I've come to the conclusion that mental health is learning to agree with God. If you want secular terms, it's learning to conform to reality and work with it. And that's the only way success is possible. The moment you start making up reality as you go along, you begin to move straight into psychosis.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So in New Age teaching, they say you create reality. I say, no, you create your perception of reality, and it may or may not be accurate. But if it's not accurate, your life will be a failure. You will end up unhappy, miserable, anxious, depressed, frightened, scared, and you will not enjoy success in life because you're at odds with reality.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I've said before, actually, that it's wrong to think of, and I'm talking from a Christian perspective, it's wrong to think of Christianity or true religion as an additional thing to being an ordinary human being. Rather,
that's right.
As a description of what it means to be a human being.
Christ is calling us to absolute authenticity. He is calling us to be our authentic selves and not to put up with attachment injury and the various adjustments to that. He is calling us to be free, to be who he has called us or made us to be, and not to end up addicted or oppressed by foreign survival kits and false defence mechanisms, which is where most people live. Because most people express an addiction of some form or a psychosis or delusion of some form in their way of coping.
Yeah.
And as a result, they're sick, they're unfit, they're broke, they're powerless, they're depressed, they're anxious, they have OCDs, they have addictions throughout their nature. And that's how I see the world. And I've spent my life freeing myself of the mistaken beliefs that I accumulated by the score before I was 20 years old.
Yeah, I thought that just occurred to me as you were describing people. Your people, right? You're
yes,
one of them.
Yes.
This all applies to you as well.
Yeah, all these battles I've had. I've had battles with sexual immorality. I've had battles with same-sex interest. I've had battles with addictions, I've had battles with depression, I've had battles with anxiety, and I've come to realise that I can be free of all those things when I start cleaning up my own mind and the false loyalties that crowded in there in years as a child formed by abuse, parental abandonment, parental abuse, and parental delinquency. Yeah, we are the results of those who trained us. Broken parents produce broken children.
Okay. So you may have partially answered this, but if we can narrow in specifically, what is the void that specifically Christian counselling fills? And so I'm thinking of... Well, no, I won't tell you what I'm thinking of. I want to know what you're thinking.
Well, Maslow's hierarchy of needs makes it clear that we have some basic needs essential to being human. The need for belonging, the need for value, the need for acceptance, the need for security, and the need for progress. And every child begins to find their own way of meeting those needs. But Christian faith is the only life approach that I have found that has an answer to all those needs, and a healthy answer, not an unhealthy one. Otherwise, I'm going to a person for my belonging that results in codependency. I'm going to a thing for peace of mind that results in addiction. I'm going to a philosophy to get that sense of progress, and I end up an intellectual academic devoid of emotion, or I end up addicted to golf, you know, that need for progress. So what is it that will supply those needs in a healthy way? For me, it's the Christian faith. And I have explored the other faiths. I have explored the other philosophies. I don't consider myself dogmatic because I'm still listening to antithesis, and I'm still weighing it up for myself. My life has been a dedicated search for truth, and it's taken me into some pretty interesting places, and some places that I had to back out of fairly quickly because they were going to end up in deviancy, or they were going to end up in soul injury. I'm not up for that.
That was a long time ago?
Oh, it's a lifelong process. The search for truth and the quest for truth is what it is to follow Christ.
No, I mean the realisation, heck, I better reverse out of here. Are we talking in your formative stages?
Oh yes. Well, you know, every time I adopt an idea that proves to be wrong, it's time to back up.
Yeah.
And epistemology will protect you. I've studied philosophy of religion and epistemology, and when people say to me, what gives you the right to think that you know the solution or the answer or the right way, I will say it is a conscientious, diligent study over many years of epistemology. And most people don't even know what the word means.
So epistemology is the study of knowledge, what it is, and how you acquire it, for those who don't know.
And, you know, it was deliberately left out of as New Zealand educational syllabus. And that's why Kiwis can't think straight.
Yeah.
They've never been trained in epistemology. Whereas if you did schooling under the baccalaureate, then the theory of learning and the theory of knowing, it should be well known to you. But though mostly European schools took on the baccalaureate, New Zealand hasn't by and large.
Okay. So, I've been asking these general questions because you are a counsellor in broad terms. Like, you don't just have this one thing that you bang on about, but there is one thing that you've become slightly notorious for, and so I do want to talk about that with you. That is the issue of so-called conversion therapy, gay conversion therapy. So you've had some experiences in the wake of, and for those who don't know, there was a legislative change here in New Zealand, a bill that became an act that banned conversion therapy.
And not just New Zealand, it was a fad. It went through half the states.
It has been a global phenomenon.
Went through Australia.
It really has.
It's a fad.
How did you become a target? So walk us through that, and what sort of, I mean, have you, I don't want to assume, have you faced harassment or pressure as a result of this change? Do you do anything, in your opinion, that would actually fall afoul of this law?
Well, as a therapist of more than 30 years' experience, I went up to put in my submission against it because I said in all the years that I've been counselling for sexual orientation issues, I have found trauma in the history and background and formative years of every single gay person that I've worked with, every single one. It was nothing to do with chromosomes, nothing to do with genetics. there was childhood abuse, there was childhood abandonment, there were delinquency issues in the parents. In every single case, they were bonding injuries, they were attachment injuries in every single case. And in every single case of a person who was same-sex attracted, if they really wanted out of that attraction, they could have it. They could have the freedom from that desire. And so I went up to say, this legislation flies in the face of their freedom to explore an alternative. And for goodness sake, just yesterday, another person who has identified as gay for the last 20 years said to me, "You're the only therapist I could find who had the balls to discuss this with me in the face of that legislation. All of the rest are running for cover." And they refuse to help me. And I said, of course, because that legislation is itself illegal. It goes against the Bill of Rights and the Bill of Free Speech from the 1960s. It is anti-legislation. And that's why the first attempt to put it through was thrown out by Parliament. But thanks to Princess Jacinda, it got pushed through. And as a result of that, we have lost the right to free speech in this country. And it was pulled out from right under our noses by gutless people who would not stand up and say, no, I'm opposing this. So that's where it began, plus the testimony of some of my clients who said once was gay, now not, thanks to therapy with David Riddell. And of course that was as popular as a pork pie in a Jewish party, wasn't it? That didn't go down at all well. And so there is no vengeance like the vengeance of gays who have been proved to be wrong in this dogmatic idolatry which they suffer from. So that began the process, really, and all I want to do is be allowed to the freedom to dialogue with these people and present my antithesis. That's all I want.
Now, to play devil's advocate somewhat, what one of your gay critics might say is, well, sure, Dave, but these are just gay people who have felt the need for therapy, so it's not much surprise that you would find some sort of brokenness in their past. What about me, just a happy gay person who's living his life?
Well, if you're content with that, I have nothing to say to you.
Right.
If you're content with that, I'm not on a crusade. I'm not trying to persecute gays, and I wish they would do me the same courtesy.
Sure, yeah, okay. Right. So you've taken, well, I was going to ask you, but it sounds like you've already quite clearly expressed your view that, that so-called conversion therapy, potentially at least, works.
Oh, well, of course it does. I wouldn't be still, open to people coming to me and bringing this up as a topic in the privacy of the counselling session. And if I were to shut them down, that would be highly irresponsible on my part. And it would also be doing the very thing that the gays are claiming that I do, converting and being dogmatic. And by the way, this whole legislation fiasco is brought about by people's inability to distinguish conversion from coercion. You look at the dictionary, there is no element of coercion, real or imagined, present in the word conversion. Everyone comes to counselling for conversion of some sort. Otherwise, why would they come?
Because it just means change, doesn't
They
it?
want change. And every person comes to me for change in some area of their lives. So if I were to cease to be a conversion therapist, I would cease to see anybody about any issue whatsoever. So this madness that took hold, thanks to television media and the imbalanced presentation of the Sunday program and various like it. You know, I was defamed throughout the Sunday program and on Radio New Zealand, RNZ, subsequently, repeatedly since. I haven't threatened them with litigation, but I have plenty of evidence to convict them of defamation if I want.
What do they say about you that's not true?
Well, they say that I am practicing conversion therapy techniques in the sense that they are coercive, and I do not do that. I have never ever put any kind of religious or psychological or emotional pressure on a client because that is disgraceful conduct, and I'm not into it. And the counsellors that I train are never allowed to bring any pressure or duress to bear on their client, because a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. It doesn't work, it's ineffective. And by the way, coercive practices haven't been in New Zealand now for decades. There was some time back.
They're banned by other legislation entirely.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
Yes, they are. And that legislation was perfectly appropriate to prevent coercive practices. Yeah.
You've raised it a few times now, but you're right. There does seem to be almost a creed that people are just required to believe that.
That same-sex orientation is genetic as a dogma.
Yeah,
it's a religion.
People can change in all sorts of ways,
but not
that
in this
one.
matter. Yeah.
Not that one.
It's irrational. It's illogical. It's emotion-based reasoning, and I'll tell you what it's driven by, Glenn. It's driven by a false compassion. These are the days of false compassion, where rescuers predominate, and rescuers have compassion without limits. They have compassion without wisdom. They have compassion without understanding that there must be limits. It's in the same vein as the mini emperors of the solo child. It's in the same vein as the helicopter or hovering parents. It's in the same vein as confusing love with indulgence. And that is the great confusion of our age today, that indulgence and love have been completely synthesized.
Yeah, if you love me, you will indulge whatever I say about myself.
Right. There is no tough love in the rainbow community or in the attitude towards the rainbow community. It's not allowed. It's outlawed. Tough love of any sort is outlawed. And as a result, we have these injection rooms that are becoming cesspits and hellholes in Melbourne and in Sydney and in places in the...
where heroin addicts can go and nail up.
That's right. That's the perfect example of what I'm talking about. You know, the Demon Dan in Melbourne is just letting loose false compassion everywhere he operates. And they're going to pay the price, the same as Los Angeles and California are paying the price. Yeah.
Okay. I've heard you say previously, in fact, this was a very short interview with Sean Plunkett, who I'm rather fond of, where you said that the number of people, he asked you how many people have converted under your care, and you said something like, well, as many as who wanted to.
That's right.
So what does success look like? I mean, how common is it? Because I think he was going for a number and you didn't really give him one.
Well, that's the empiricistic disease. Everyone trained in statistics has drunk of the,
what are your
poisonous chalice. The poisonous chalice is empiricism. It is truth driven by statistics. But the problem is that statistics is a very dangerous field for the amateur. Because it's not the statistics, it's the way they're interpreted that is the problem. And so when people say to me, what percentage of your people come with same-sex or sexual orientation issues, they're looking for a statistic. If they say to me, what percentage of your homosexual clients convert and become heterosexual, they're looking for a statistic. But there's no healing in statistics. We look to statistics for feedback, but the assumptions built into that question are horrendous. For example, I can tell it's effective or it's right or it's true by statistics. You can't tell truth by statistics. You can only observe what humanity are doing and draw your conclusions from that. But you can't find truth in statistics. That's the lie of the belief of democracy, that enough people believe it, it's true. Well, that's a nonsense, and there's nothing in Scripture to base that on. In fact, the opposite is true. Christ said that the people who have grasped truth and reality are the minority and always will be.
But you must see it happening often enough that you think, okay, this is something that can be done. This is something that is real.
Well, I don't keep names and addresses of people who claim to have converted, if you like. But just yesterday I had another case of a very grateful person released from same-sex addiction, attraction, desire, whatever you want to call it. And every week I enable somebody to find release from a perversion that is harassing them of any sort. And it could be a perversion regarding food, regarding cross-dressing, regarding an OCD, all kinds of deviations from mental health. And so, yeah, I'm happy to say that I'm booked up fully. Every slot is taken for months ahead because people know that if they come to me, they will be enabled to get the change they seek.
I noticed you just used the word perversion, which some viewers might shrink back at. Is that the kind of term you would use with a client?
Well, it's a loaded term straight away. What does it actually mean? A perversion is any deviation from what is considered normal. As a Christian, I could be considered a pervert in a secular society of atheists. So I have deviated from the standard norm. But perversion is not a word to be frightened of, the same as deviation is not a word to be frightened of. I consider heterosexuality to be normal for 100 different reasons, on 100 different levels, and therefore same-sex orientation can be considered a deviation from heterosexuality.
Okay. Yep.
And the Bible's quite clear, God is against same-sex orientation. He's not against filial love between brothers. We see clearly there the picture of the young teenage disciple John leaning against the chest or breast of Jesus at the Last Supper. That is an intimate embrace. But it's not sexual. We see that the King David, the psalmist, loved Jonathan above the love of woman, but it wasn't sexual. He loved him, he didn't sleep with him. And that's where we must continue to draw the line. And there is a line of morality between the boss and his secretary, between the uncle and the nephew. There is a line of reality that we have to draw in all these situations. All of us are called to restrain our sexual appetite.
Right, okay, yep. Now, I think what you might say, and this issue comes up generally when the issue is raised in the public square in a secular context where someone asks the question of whether or not conversion therapy is possible. One pushback you'll get is, why would you want to be a part of someone rejecting, suppressing or changing their same-sex attraction? Is there something wrong with that?
Well, that's for them to decide. They have to decide that I'm not their conscience. If they want to follow Jehovah, the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition, then they have to come to grips with almost every book in the Bible condemns it. They have to get to grips with that. They have to get to grips with the fact that it means childlessness, that it means no happy family situation where the complementarity of male and female work together for the common good. They have to get to grips with the fact that they will never give their parents grandchildren. They have to get to grips with the fact that they may well end up in a very lonely relationship that is based on codependency and manipulation and control.
But even if I can't produce children, and I want a child, can't I have one?
Oh, well, you know that there are ways and means to have a child. But some of the saddest children and adults that I've worked with are people whose father and mother were both male or both female. And there is always injury apparent in their psyche and in their formation as a result of that. And for some it's devastating.
Yeah, I mean it's all very well for someone like me or anyone else to sit back and go, well, that's not my experience, but what would I know? I mean, you've seen this, have you?
Well, I worked with it regularly and still work with it regularly. Yeah. In fact, the last person I knew to have suicided was the product of a mother and a father who was also a female, and they were so involved in their own issues and in their own codependency that they basically completely neglected the child. And she grew up in a spirit of abandonment and eventually killed herself because nothing had nurtured her to life. She'd never been nurtured to life. Now, you don't have to have a female mother and a female father to experience that, but it's certainly contributed.
And obviously you can have a female mother and a male father and still end up in that terrible situation.
Yes, you can, and that doesn't justify that either. As I said, attachment injuries result from three things. They result from premature sexual awakening, which the child cannot handle, it devastates them. Premature same-sex awakening is one of the most common causes of later homosexuality, and often forgotten by the child themselves until they bring it to mind.
There's a very unpopular study people didn't. I mean, I raised it on my blog years ago just because it is fascinating, but there was a pretty unpleasant social reaction to it. There was a study that came out of the University of Otago, which indicated that children who had been abused, adults who had been abused as children were statistically far more likely to be non-heterosexual in adulthood. And just for raising this, the study was torn to pieces by people like the AIDS Foundation and what you can't draw attention to this. We don't think that way about sexuality.
Look, statistics don't determine what people believe. Hidden agendas determine what people believe. And often those agendas are very, very strong, and often they are unknown to the person with the beliefs. And in therapy, we can expose those agendas, and then that leaves them free to make a free decision, not a decision under duress. Removing duress is what therapy is all about. And attachment injury, premature awakening, defensive detachment, those things have to be exposed and fronted up to before a person can make a free decision to be their authentic selves. And you know, a lot of the people that attack me are so ignorant, they don't even know what defensive detachment is. They don't even know what an attachment injury is. They don't even know what a depressive hypothesis is. They don't even know what critical period attachment is. And so they are completely ill-equipped to understand or think their way through this. And if they can't even tell the difference between conversion and coercion, I'm wasting my time with them. This is a deep level of ignorance that we're dealing with here, Glenn.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's easily believable.
So, you know, to try and even it out, here's Answering Pro-Gay Theology by Joe Dallas. Now, Joe Dallas himself is a practicing homosexual for 33 years. And then he was led to repentance, and then he found abundant and true life. And he writes an expose of Vine's book, which I've forgotten the name of it. But
God and the Gay Christian.
God and the Gay Christian, yeah. So this is the best expose, and you can download this booklet from joedallas.com. Joedallas.com this is the best expose of what's missing in the thinking of the same-sex orientated person, but it's also the best
from a theological point of view. Yeah.
Not just theology, but certainly theology. And I myself have done my own effort on Riddell's War Chest.
Now, what's that?
And this is a glossary of the terms that have been used and abused to darken counsel by words without knowledge, to quote Job. And so this is for every person to take on the rainbow dogma and idolatry.
Idolatry would be the worship of ideology.
Yeah, that'll do.
Yeah.
Because I do find Christians speechless in the face of the aggression of the rainbow community. And, for example, transgender. There's no such thing. Nobody becomes a female after being born a male, and vice versa. It's a delusion. It's complete psychosis. There's no such thing as gender transition. That's a fabrication.
Well, they wouldn't say that they're changing their sex from male to female, but
they believe they
changing
are.
Their gender identity.
Oh, well, making that distinction straight away is a nonsense.
Right.
You can't have a gender identity unless you're already in psychosis, unless you're already deluding yourself. Gender identity is what we say about people who refuse to acknowledge reality and would rather make it up as they go along. And they are claiming a gender that they do not have.
What do you say to people, though, who, after going through what they consider to be a transition from being a woman to being a man or vice versa, and who say, look, now I just feel more at peace with myself?
Give it time, it's going to collapse. The psychosis is going to collapse. The delusion is going to collapse. It may not be in the first 5 years, but it will collapse. Why? Because you can't fight reality. You can try, you can beat your head against a brick wall, but you can't actually win.
Right.
Yeah, God made them male and female and nothing else. All you can do is rail against that and try and fit reality into your emotional-based reasoning. And emotion-based reasoning is the demon behind all of this nonsense. all of this confusion comes back to emotion-driven reasoning. My feelings couldn't possibly lie to me. And when parents indulge that philosophy in children again and again and again, then the child has no choice but to become a slave to their emotion. That's reality.
Okay.
Welcome to it.
Yeah.
Back to it.
So that's where where my questions are going. Oh, my questions will go to issues in gender later, but I do want to put this question out there because you must be able to understand the concern about and I know you've talked about the distinction between conversion that is coercive and conversion that is not, because coercion is not inherent at all to the concept of conversion.
And I'm anti-coercive, not just on philosophical or ideological grounds. I'm anti-coercive because it doesn't work.
Yeah, and this is the thing. I mean, you have to be very understanding of those who oppose conversion therapy because you've heard the stories. I mean, when this bill was being considered, people brought those stories to the forefront of people who were subjected to what was called gay conversion therapy, which was just horrific treatment. I mean, they were given Lupron, basically chemically castrated. They were given electric shock therapy and so on. And this wasn't contrary to what people think. This was not a religious practice. The church didn't do anything like this. These were the secular authorities. And as someone who is a Christian, which should mean that there's a motivation of love, and as a therapist, what do you say to people who were hurt by all of that, or who associate what you do with that, and who can't separate the two?
Well, I say you need to reconsider the situation today. We're not fighting ghosts. These are ghosts from the 50s and the 60s when psychology was drunk on its own power and its own arrogance, thanks to Freud and others. But I have personally not heard the story of someone who was subject to any kind of formal coercion for the last 40 years. I've certainly seen harassment, and I've certainly seen a persecution of people who identified as gay, and I've always felt that that was hideous and unjust and unwarranted and unhelpful. It just forces them into a corner, and now they're fighting back. But they're fighting back in ignorance. They're not fighting back in insight. They haven't read Dr. Leanne Payne's book. They haven't read well, there are a lot of other books that express the actual pathway into same-sex orientation.
Who's Leanne Payne? I haven't heard of that book.
She's an Anglican psychologist, recently passed away, but she wrote several books on the restoration of the gay mind to heterosexuality, and she was a lay priest as well as a practicing psychotherapist. And Elizabeth Moberly was her peer and colleague. They're both British, I think, possibly Anglicans by background. But if you read Elizabeth Moberly and Leanne Payne, you'll understand that the church missed a great invitation there to understand the formative factors of same-sex and missed it. They just didn't take them seriously. But the writings are there, the books are there. Restoring the Broken Image is the most famous of those.
Okay, thank you. I'll look that up. So do you see in your line of work people in your office at least who are there because they struggle with what is now called gender identity? And if so, do you see it more than you once did? What does it look like from the standpoint of a counsellor who sees a lot of people?
Oh, it's a social craze. It's social hysteria. Children, 4, 5 and 6 are now wondering when they're going to turn into a girl or whether they're a boy in a girl's body. And this is the indoctrination that the rainbow community have imposed on children. And it becomes a tyranny. It becomes reverse conversion. And let me make this clear, there are far more heterosexual children being converted to same-sex orientation and transgender as ever were converted the other way.
When you say converted there, not as an explicit someone
Oh
coming in?
yes, absolutely. They're going into the schools and explicitly converting children through deception and through the wrong use of statistics and through stories and through popularising transgender, and as a result it's becoming a social phenomenon.
How might that would that be like someone saying, look, if you experience the following things, then sounds like you're gay or sounds like you're trans?
That's right.
Right, okay.
That's right. Or, 1 in 5 of you or 1 in 10 of you are actually in the wrong body. That sort of deception. And these people who are promulgating that, they may be well-intentioned, but they're evil.
That's a concept I intend to write about, the idea of being very conscientiously wicked.
Yes, yes. Well, compassion and empathy is a very powerful motive. And if you're looking for... what's the term they use, the moral high ground, or if you're looking for a cause, there's a term, I've just forgotten it, well known, but basically seeking a cause, then this might well be it. You might be the person who, gives people permission to be a girl in a boy's body.
There's no sense of personal drivenness like the feeling that you are the one on the side of love and compassion.
Yeah, what does Jordan Peterson refer to it as? He calls it, I'll find that term because I think it's a very useful one.
If it takes too long to find it, we'll just edit it so that it doesn't take long.
Sorry, I've just had a blank on this word. Virtue signalling, there it is.
Oh, that, okay, yes.
Virtue signalling. This is the thing. You can get into virtue signalling with that hope of being righteous, but in fact, you've picked a loser by indulging psychosis.
Okay. All right. So, once upon a time, the controversial issue would be something like same-sex marriage. It's not really controversial now. The issue of the day is gender identity, and specifically the gender identity of young people. That seems to me like it is kind of the hot button thing now around which liberal culture is rallying. Now, I've argued elsewhere that the real reason for the conversion therapy ban being written and passed was not about sexual orientation. It was to stop anyone from getting in the way of young people being affirmed in their gender identity. That's my opinion anyway, and being streamlined into a process of transition, possibly involving hormone therapy and eventually surgery. Now, I know that what I'm about to ask is a very open-ended question, but what's going on? Why are we seeing and hearing so much of this now, and why is there this almost religious push against any questioning of that standpoint?
Well, every generation seeks moral armament. Every generation seeks a cause that they can live for. Every generation wants a expression of that. What was the word I used? Jordan's word.
Virtue signalling?
Yeah, every generation seeks a way of signalling their virtue, and whether it's Black Lives Matter or whether it's some version of restoring the injustices of racism.
Climate change is a big one.
They're all looking for that cause that can announce them as virtuous, and more virtuous perhaps than the people before them, the generation before them. And if you add that to a false compassion, a false empathy, then you've got a very powerful force unleashed.
And when you say false, they believe they're quite genuinely compassionate.
Oh, yes, they are. But if you look at the fruit of that compassion, you find indulged children who are deeply confused about a whole bunch of things. They don't know whether they can light a fire out of coal or wood without polluting the environment. They don't know whether to be a girl or a boy. They don't know what dresses or dress to use or adopt. They don't know whether they should be allowed to experiment with drugs or not. They've been brought up in utter confusion because of promiscuous parents.
Promiscuous parents?
Yes, promiscuous parents who have morals to suit the day and the feeling and the mood of the day. Yeah, that's promiscuity.
Okay. Now, before we wrap up, and I know we've mostly been talking about the issues that you've. Well, I don't want to exaggerate. You haven't really become that notorious, but the reason I heard of you, for example, was to do with your stance on the issue of conversion therapy. But you are a counsellor. I mean, this is the broad field in which you work. I assume most viewers don't know about Living Wisdom. I just became aware of it recently, but that's what you do. What is it?
Living Wisdom is a behind-the-curtains network of Christian counsellors who have not given up absolutes, who have not lost their grip on biblical faith, who have not submitted to the fear-mongering that is abroad today, who think for themselves and will give advice when necessary. They are not authoritarian counsellors, nor are they dogmatic fundamentalists. They are people who want to be there when somebody needs to express the consternations, the historic abuse, and the decisions made in the light of that historic abuse. And they want to be for them and to help them through those difficult places in their lives according to the direction of Christ and the compassion of Father God. So what does that mean? It means that I hand train them, I hand pick them, and they are very, very successful counsellors in their own right. Most of them belong to Christian Counselling or Association of New Zealand Counsellors, but certainly not all. I do not belong to those groups myself because I am at variance with some of their own statements of belief. But having said that, I have no problem with them joining those institutions for accountability. But Living Wisdom is basically what is successful living. How do you locate those criteria and how do you conform to them? And how do you free yourself of OCD, free yourself of addiction, free yourself of unwanted same-sex orientation, free yourself of the delusions of the day, and lead what I consider a healthy, normal, successful life. Yeah.
Okay. That's pretty all-encompassing.
Well, you know, this very classroom here is where we train them, and we train 30 per class, and they're booked up for months ahead, and they are worldwide now. We have Living Wisdom counsellors in many countries around the world, and they're very successful at what they do, and none of them are dogmatic, none of them are authoritarian, and none of them, I would say, would be literalists as Christians, because we know that where literalism goes in Christianity, and it's not always healthy.
What's literalism?
Well, it's the difference between literalism and fundamentalism. I am a fundamentalist Christian in as much as I hold on to loyalty to the fundamentals of the Christian faith.
Yep.
But I'm not a literalist. I don't take every scripture as if it was a literal command for me. The Bible wasn't written like that or for that.
Right.
Yeah. Make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes. Now, this last question has nothing to do with any of the questions that I have asked you so far.
A wild card. I'm looking forward to this already.
Yeah. And I was actually being interviewed on someone's YouTube channel, and they asked me this question, and I wasn't at all ready for it. I thought, oh, that's an interesting one. It made me think. And so from now on, I always ask this question because of where it could go. David Riddell, what gives you hope? Now, this doesn't have to be a grand cosmic, my Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, although that's a perfectly decent answer, but anything big or small, what gives you hope?
You're going to be shocked by my answer, so you better put your seatbelt on.
Okay.
Yeah, this is turbulence. Okay? The reality of hell gives me hope.
Goodness.
Why? Because hell is the place where God will incarcerate, separate, isolate all evil, together with all of the suffering that is born out of it. All right? Hell gives me hope because without hell there could be no heavenly hereafter. It would just be a continuation of the suffering and the pain and the evil we have on earth. So yes, hell gives me hope. The judgment day of God gives me hope because the judgment day of God will be the final court that releases society from all evildoers. Yeah, follow me?
I am following you.
Okay, so it's the distinction made on that judgment day. Jesus said, many are called to heaven, but only a few are chosen. And I will be in the chosen because I have obeyed and complied for all my life the decrees, the statutes and the commands of Christ the Lord. And by that I do not cause pain, suffering or human evil. I relieve people of it every working day of my life. That's what I do. And so my hope is that one day that fight will come to an end, and only the presence of a hell of incarceration of all evil gives me that option of a heaven free of all suffering and all evil.
Well,
not what you're expecting.
That is not what I expected at all.
But that is a Christological view of judgment and hell.
Within theology, much of my training was in theology, the subject that I've written about probably more than any other is the doctrine of hell. So there's a lot but that would be an entirely different interview. What I'm offering in that closing question is unconditional affirmation, because that was your opportunity to speak. And that's a unique answer. I've not encountered that one before, but there it is. That's Dave Riddell's answer.
Yes, I've talked to enough people who have had near-death or post-death experiences to know that for some they come back extremely frightened, and for some they come back in euphoria at what they've seen. And you get both.
Okay. David Riddell, I am greatly appreciative of the time that you have given me. Thank you.
Let's hope your viewers are too.
Let's hope. All right, we're done. That was great.
Well,
have you done anything like that before? Really sort of been given a platform by someone outside yourself to put
only
your views?
by high school students from a school in Christchurch. They did it over the phone. They put these kinds of questions to me, and I said, congratulations guys, you show more maturity than the mainstream media journalists of this country.